Maybe like some of you, I grew up in a household where we were always encouraged as kids to give up something for Lent. Lent is that sort of season of the church that's between Ash Wednesday and Easter. And it's a season where a lot of families, a lot of people do a spiritual practice of giving something up during that time or taking something else on. Whatever, they're focusing in on their spiritual practice of Lent. And my mom always would make a big deal about it. And one year she announced to the whole family, she said, I am going to give up sweets for Lent. And we were like, great, Mom, like the super for you. I don't remember what I gave up that year, but I'm fairly confident I didn't actually accomplish all 40 days of Lent. So one day during my mom's Lenten fast from sweets, we were sitting in the kitchen and all of a sudden she reaches up in the cupboard and she pours a handful of chocolate chips and she pops them in her mouth. And appalled, I said, Mom, you gave up sweets for Lent. What are you doing? And she looked at me and she pointed to the package and she said, Angela, they are semi-sweet. I think we all do this. I think we always look for loopholes when it comes to our temptations. We look for loopholes when we are put to the test. Now, Jesus, in Matthew chapter 4, Jesus is sent into the wilderness. Now, it's important to know that it happens right after Matthew chapter 3, where Jesus is named and claimed with his identity of God's Son, God's beloved, with whom God is well pleased. It's immediately after that all of a sudden the questions come up. The questions come up from the tempter, from the devil. If you are the Son of God, he's going to test that identity that was claimed on him in chapter 3. Long before the temptations that Jesus endures, the Israel people were tempted in the wilderness too. And so the original readers, this Jewish convert audience, are now still seeing how Jesus' life ties to everything that has ever happened. When the Israelites were out in the desert being tempted for sort of the same kind of things. First, Jesus is tempted with hunger. Now, back in the wilderness, the Israelites were tempted with hunger too. After they escaped from Egypt, they complained and they said, well, we should have just stayed slaves in Egypt. There was enough to food there. They didn't trust that God was going to provide their manna, their bread for the day. Jesus first is tempted with hunger. And his hunger, he overcomes that temptation in which the Israelites did not overcome their temptation. The second temptation Jesus experiences is putting God to the test. The tempter here in this story is sneaky. He takes Jesus to Jerusalem and starts to quote scriptures at him, saying that the tempter understands how Jesus is connected to everything that's happened in the past, just to see if Jesus can handle testing sort of God. But such testing from God doesn't actually show us that we trust God, but we don't trust God. So we try out the promises of God, but it's actually a sign of doubt because it changes our relationship with God, saying that we are in charge and we expect God to fulfill those promises rather than the other way around. This is what the devil is doing to Jesus here. Now, you and I, we've done sort of the same sort of thing when we have prayed and be like, okay, God, if you save my friend, I will do this. In that way, we're not trusting God. Instead, we are saying, like, I'm in charge and I expect God to fulfill my promises. The third thing that Jesus is tested with is false worship and power. As the people sat in Israel in the desert and waited for Moses to descend from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments, they created a pagan god, a statue, and they began to worship it. Jesus' life is going to be hard, and Jesus knows that it's going to be hard and it's going to be messy, but he also knows that God's power doesn't look like power coming down. Instead, it's subversive power. It is not authoritative and aggressive. Instead, it looks like servanthood and washing people's feet and listening to people's struggles and healing people's wounds. It's a different kind of power. It's a bottom-up power. It's only when Jesus passes these tests, he double confirms his identity. That's when his ministry starts. He starts going and gathers his few followers. He starts teaching and healing and gathering crowds to confirm the work that God has called Jesus to do. So here's my questions for you. Number one, what's your biggest temptation? What about it causes you to struggle? And number two, when Jesus overcame temptation, it showed that Jesus is trustworthy. So how can you trust Jesus with your temptations? Thanks for joining us.